Whole Hog Sports presents the basketball podcast of Mid-America, the premier Arkansas Hoops podcast, brought to you by Landers Toyota of Northwest Arkansas. With Whole Hog Sports basketball analyst Scotty Bordelon, here's your host, Matt Jones.
It hasn't always been pretty, but Arkansas is 7-0 this basketball season. The Razorbacks with a win over Central Arkansas on Wednesday night at Bud Walton Arena. 97-60 was the final score, but it was really a tale of two halves, as Bob wrote about in his game story. Arkansas actually trailed the Bears for a short time in the first half, only led them 41-35 at halftime, then really pulled away in the second half. Up next for the Razorbacks is UALR on Saturday afternoon at Bud Walton Arena. Matt Jones with Scotty Bordelon of WholeHogSports.com, Bob Holt of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Scotty, let's start with you. The game Wednesday night against UCA, I don't know that we should really pay a whole lot of attention to point spreads, but the point spread for that game was Arkansas by 33, so the expectation was that Arkansas was going to win the game real handily. They didn't play up to that expectation in the first half, but what were your thoughts on the first half and maybe how this team is playing right now? They're number 10 in the polls, but it sure feels like there's a lot more there in the tank if they can find it.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right about that. I mean, you're 7 games into the season. Obviously, you're 7 games in. It's very early on, and you're still trying to work out some of the kinks and find your best combinations. And guys are still trying to identify their roles, really, on offense. Like Devo Davis and Stanley Amudi, I think, are the two best examples of that. Like Stanley was a high-usage guy at South Dakota, and now, he's maybe the fourth. Sometimes he's the 4th or the 5th scoring option on this team, and you could probably say the same for Devo too. So that's been an adjustment because both of those guys are pretty good scorers, I guess pretty good scores to great scores, and they're just kind of trying to feel their way through this early season. But I mean, I looked up at one point in the game, and I was talking to a guy next to me and was like, the spread on this game is 33 points, right? And Arkansas is trailing, I think, at like the 8-point mark or the 8-minute mark in the first half. I'm like, I don't know if Arkansas is going to get there. But, that spurt ability that Bob wrote about, I think maybe before the Kansas City trip, that reared its head again. And that, that really helped Arkansas cover that figure. But I think the transition offense was really key for Arkansas. Their 32 fast break points were the most that they've had in a game under Eric Musselman. So that was, I think there was a big emphasis on pushing the pace, and that was kind of reflected in 83 possessions, the most Arkansas's had in a game this season. So that was a positive for me.
Bob, you're an AP voter. How does Arkansas stack up to some of the other teams that you see right now?
Well, I mean, they're 7-0. They've taken care of business. I know they haven't played a ranked team yet. OU might get ranked by the time they play them. OU knocked off Florida last night, but it's not Arkansas's fault that Illinois got beat by Cincinnati. I think Cincinnati's a pretty solid team. They went home and got beat by Mammoth. Northern Iowa went on the road and beat St. Bonaventure. I think Penn gave Villanova pretty, a good game last night or the other night. I think they lost by 15, but Villanova's top 5, top 6 team. So Arkansas has so far been able to avoid some of these upset losses. BYU got beat by Utah Valley or Utah Valley State or some school in Utah. You're thinking, what are they doing losing to those guys? Now they did go on the road. I'll give them credit for that, but I agree with Scotty, or maybe it was you that said, I think there's a lot more in the tank with Arkansas. They're not shooting from outside real well. They certainly didn't shoot free throws well last night, but, when they need their defense, it's been there most of the time. They're rebounding pretty well. Last night was just so sloppy. Stanley led him with 17, but he should have had 19 because he missed a dunk. He cost Jalen Williams a couple of assists because there was another time Jalen was there was a loose ball. Jalen was on his back on the floor and tossed it up to Stanley. He missed a chippy, and then he got the rebound and put it back. But honestly, Jalen should have had a couple more assists. I think there should be a category where you get an assist where you should have had an assist or something like that. Scotty could probably figure that out with those analytics.
I track that stuff. Yeah. That's potential assists for sure.
Okay. And then also, I think I remember 2 cases of JD Note like bringing the ball up, not being pressured, and he like the ball went off his thigh, and I think he recovered the ball both times. Which thinking, here's a very elite offensive player dribbling the ball off his thigh. So I don't know if it was because they were such big favorites or what exactly was going on, but Arkansas was pretty sloppy at times. And then when they had to put into gear, they did. And obviously UCA is 1-7, but they played a pretty tough schedule. Got beat badly at Baylor, lost to St. Louis. They got a good win over ORU. So, I think if you could have some issues like Arkansas did miss it. I think at one point they were 5 of 14 on free throws. You're thinking, what's going on? I think that kind of spread to everything that was going on. But if you can sort of play so-so and beat anybody by 37, I think that shows you've got a pretty good team.
Just going to your point on Stanley, he had a really good night, I thought, against UCA. Like, he got the ball. I think 3 of his touches that he ended up scoring on originated, on that left block area. And that's been a spot on the floor that he's been really good throughout his career. And that's obviously with Eric Musselman just so keyed into the analytics and where guys are best operating. I mean, he looked really good there, but he still missed some like really high quality shots. And if he makes those, we're looking at maybe a 24, 25 point game from him. And then people are maybe, as fired up about him as I am.
Bob touched on the poor 3-point shooting, and we talked about that on the last podcast. And we kind of hypothesized at that point that they had played at the T-Mobile Center in Kansas City, which is not a traditional basketball arena, and how sometimes the depth perception in those types of venues can hurt teams. Arkansas wasn't the only team that shot poorly. In fact, all 4 teams shot pretty poorly from 3-point range in Kansas City. But they've come home to Bud Walton Arena, and it hadn't gotten any better the last couple of games. I think I've got them in their last 4 games. They're 13 of 74 from beyond the arc, and now they're shooting 28.9% from beyond the arc for the season. Scotty, I know you go back and you look at the shot charts. Do you think this is a matter of, are they not taking good looks from 3-point range? Or are they just missing looks? What do you think is the deal there with the perimeter shooting? Because you got to feel like if they're going to play better when they play, better competition, that's going to have to improve.
Yeah, I think one of the things you can look at right now, and I did a review kind of November, Arkansas's first 6 games, and JD Notae was 14 of 51 from 3. And so you probably think that among the guys who play, a good number of minutes, Jackson Robinson, according to Devontae Davis, is Arkansas's best 3-point shooter, but he's not been, I think he had played like 11 minutes in November or something like that. So I think you got to look at JD, like he's their highest volume 3-point shooter, and he's not the most efficient perimeter shooter that Arkansas has. And so I think that's going to kind of drag your percentage down a little bit. I think Arkansas has just got to find maybe a number 2 guy, and maybe that does lead to some more run for Jackson Robinson, because I think he's got one of the prettiest strokes that has come through Arkansas in a minute. I think Stanley Amude's coming along, from 3-point range too. I think he's a real threat when he's got his feet set, and he's got, plenty of airspace. I think it's just about, kind of weeding out the attempts from guys who aren't necessarily 3-point shooters. Like, one of the things that made Devo so good against UCA was that he got away from the perimeter shot and he started attacking the rim. And so maybe you just weed out some of those attempts, your percentage is bound to rise, I would think. One other thing too is that Eric Musselman has said that Arkansas is not getting, enough corner threes. And I was just looking at some numbers earlier. They're just averaging, I think, 3.3 corner threes per game. That's one of the more efficient shots in basketball, just because it's the closest you can be to the rim behind the 3-point line on the floor. And so I think Arkansas has got to find ways to increase their volume from the corners, and maybe, cut down on some of those wing threes or 45-degree angle threes, like Eric likes to say.
And after the Penn game, Eric talked about, I think Stanley and Tony were, I can't remember what they were, but they didn't take a lot of, they were 1 of 2 or 1 of 3 or whatever. And Eric talked about they took the right kind of threes. They have too many guys trying to take threes off the bounce and not, maybe when their feet are set. And of course, Note, I think, was 0 for 6. You just feel like some of this, I think guys are just going to shoot better. I mean, I think Connor Vano, of course, he's not taking the threes as many threes because they want him more of an inside scorer, but I think he's 1 of 9. We know he's a lot better shooter than that, and I think most of his looks have been pretty good. He's not a guy that takes wild shots. I think Jackson Robinson, Scotty's right. I think he's their best 3-point shooter. And my guess is he was probably pressing because he wasn't playing a lot of minutes, but he wasn't hitting threes, but he's knocked down a couple. So that's a good sign. And it sounds like Eric wants to get him more minutes. He's a nice defender. You like his length on the perimeter. So I don't know if they're going to shoot like 40% or something, but I think at some point they're just going to start shooting better because Eric's, if you're not taking good threes, Eric's going to get you out of there. And so I think the message is going to get to, if it's okay to take a three, but just make sure it's a good three, a good look. And so I think that's going to go up. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think they're just bound to shoot better than that just by percentage. I mean, just by the odds catching up to them.
Yeah, I think Jackson is going to be good potentially for this team's 3-point shooting. Obviously, I wrote in the preseason I thought he was going to lead them in corner threes, just because I feel like he's so good at finding open spaces in the floor, and especially like in transition. Eric mentioned that he ran the floor well against UCA, but he makes things pretty easy on guys that are initiating offense or leading transition. He can run to corners, and that's a great spot for a really good shooter. I'm curious to see if he's going to get more run moving forward, because I was thinking maybe there were some defensive limitations with him that were leading to kind of a lack of minutes, but he's a guy that's got really good length. I think he's 6'6" with like a 7-foot or 7'1" wingspan. So that's a a good thing to have as a defender. So I'll be curious to see if his minutes increase in the next few games.
Stanley Amude scored 17 for the Razorbacks in the win over UCA. Scotty, you're real excited about him in the preseason based on what you'd seen from him at South Dakota. I don't know that we really saw that in the first couple of games, but it seems like here over the last 4 games or so, he's starting to show flashes of what he can do. And I'm looking at his stats right now. It's averaging 10.7 points, 5 rebounds a game. I feel like those numbers could go up.
Yeah, I think you're right too. He's really getting going offensively. The last 2 games, he's averaging 18 and 7.5 rebounds, and those are more Stanley Amude like numbers than what we were seeing early on. And like you said, I wrote in the preseason that he's been great in his career on that left baseline, and he scored 3 times there on touches in that area last night. He's getting his shots, which I think was even encouraging when they weren't falling, because he was getting to his spots. Sometimes your shots just don't fall. But the way that he kind of pogo sticks into his jumpers in that 10 to 15 foot range, defenders are not going to really contest those shots. And so it's just a matter of him getting the right amount of touch on his jumpers. But I was looking at some numbers earlier. He's at 47% on roughly 4 10 to 15 foot jumpers a game. You'd kind of like to see that percentage go up a little bit, but I feel like lately it is. And, when he's getting to his spots and he sees a couple shots go down early, that confidence starts to rise, and, he can be a real problem if he gets going.
Totally pointless side story. I know you guys didn't see this because you were at the game. Maybe you heard it on the replay, Scotty. They had John Sunvold calling the Arkansas Penn game the other day, and John Sunvold played at Missouri. I think he grew up in Kansas City. Bob, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I have that right. But he actually was born and lived for several years in South Dakota. He said that he went to some South Dakota State games. They're the Coyotes and the Jackrabbits. And he said, depending on where they would play, you would find a dead coyote or a dead jackrabbit on the floor. Stanley Amude probably didn't see that, Bob.
Yeah, I actually covered John his freshman year at Missouri. Him and Steve Stepanovich, they were the big recruits for Norm Stewart. And yeah, he's from Blue Springs, which is a suburb of Kansas City. Yeah, I didn't know about the Jackrabbits and the Coyotes. I don't think PETA would like to hear that very much. But
I don't know that the South Dakotans care.
Well, they probably don't. But I knew his brother, Bob. I think he coached in the state of South Dakota. So, but I didn't know about the family background there. But yeah, John Sunvold, speaking of shooters, he was a sweet shooting guard. He was one of the top 3-point shooters in the NBA when he played for the Spurs and some other teams.
Bob, you mentioned the Penn game against Villanova. They did lose by 15. They had their leading scorer back for that game. He wasn't able to play whenever they came to Fayetteville over the weekend. Arkansas won that game 76-60. So there's a couple of ways to look at it. Like they played Villanova even closer than they played Arkansas, but they also played Arkansas a little bit closer than maybe than some expected without their best player on the floor. And I think they lost their starting center to an injury just a few minutes into that game.
His name, I'll say Zero, like Eric called him. He was a freshman who replaced Dingle. He scored 25. So it's like Eric said, I don't think Dingle could have done any better than that kid did. But you know, it wasn't a great win for Arkansas, but again, I think Penn's a quality program. I know I think they're 3-7 now, maybe, but again, they've played a fairly tough schedule. Um, I think they opened with the loss of Florida State, pretty decisive. But Tony, Adicia Tony had been playing really well for Arkansas, was the MVP up there in Kansas City at the Hall of Fame Classic. He got ejected like 55 seconds in the second half for getting into it with one of the Penn players. I think it was Jonah Charles in the lane, kind of pushed his hands up in his face. And so he's gone, and Arkansas had not, would not pulled away at that point. And then, we were talking about Amude. He went in and had a really nice game, led him with 19, basically took Tony's minutes. So, in a weird way, I mean, you don't want to see players get ejected, especially guys playing as well as Tony has. But in maybe an odd way, that helped Amude get going, had his best game of the year, at least statistically. So I thought he did a good job of picking up the slack. And, Chris Likes, who'd been so good for him off the bench, he didn't score at all. That was, he'd been averaging 15 points off the bench. He scored, 26 in one game against Northern Iowa when they really needed him. So I think what that game demonstrated is that Arkansas's got some solid depth because, you don't have Tony for the second half. Likes doesn't score, but you have some other guys pick up the slack. And like I say, I think in a weird way, maybe that was a game that would help get Amude going.
That was Clark Slackert, by the way, who scored 25 points for Penn whenever Jordan Dingle wasn't able to play. Scotty?
Yeah, I just thought Arkansas kind of floated through that game, especially after Audice Tony went out with his ejection. They just kind of went through the motions and was kind of a very emotionless win, outside of whatever Audice did to get ejected. Some other takeaways for me in that game was JD Notae, he scored 28 points, and I feel like a lot of people just kind of shrugged it off just because it was Penn, I guess. But I thought he put great pressure on the rim. He scored 13 times inside the arc, and I think 10 or 11 of those buckets, I don't have my shot chart right next to me, but I think he scored 10 or 11 times at the rim. And for a guard of JD's size, I think he's like 6'1" or 6'2" on a good day. For him to put that much pressure on the rim is a real positive. And he had 5 assists again, so he's not the black hole that a lot of people think that he is. I think he ended up with 10 potential assists in that game, which I think would maybe matched his high in November. So that was good to see. And then Devo, even though he only scored 6 points, which that was the third consecutive game that he hadn't scored in double figures. I think it was the first stretch he's had like that since the beginning of conference play last year. But he had 5 assists too. So he found teammates. And then Jalen Williams was awesome again. I mean, you're kind of starting to look up now just about every game, and Jalen's going to have a stat line that's like 4 or 5 points, 10 or 11 rebounds, 5 or 6 assists, and he's probably going to have a charge or two taken in there somewhere too. He's just a very selfless player, no agenda, like Eric Musselman said last night, and he's just a winning player, just going to do whatever Arkansas needs him to do.
I hate to use the word Power Five in basketball because, the Big East is a power conference. I would even say the American is a power conference. So I'm going to say it like this. If you look at the teams that Arkansas has played that are in kind of those mid-major, low-major type conferences, UCA was the first team that I think I've seen this year that I didn't walk away from the game thinking, I think that team could potentially win its conference and make it to March.
Yeah, well, I think Northern Iowa definitely, I think, is going to do damage in the Missouri Valley. They might win it, they might not. And of course, in the Valley, a lot of times you got to win the tournament to get the NCAA tournament. But like I said, they went to Bonaventure and had a good win. I think they're just going to get better and better because, they'd had some injuries they were dealing with, and I think they guys were knocking some rust off. So I think Northern Iowa is going to be a real good team. I think Cincinnati, that I don't think that was. I mean, they hammered Illinois. Um, beat them by 20. I mean, I was shocked watching how well they played. I think Cincinnati's going to be a factor in the American, like you said. And I think Penn, it's usually Penn and Princeton in the Ivy, sometimes Harvard or somebody like that. But yeah, I agree. I think Arkansas, and Eric stressed this last year, they put together Anthony Root as their schedule guy, and they put together a good schedule. And last year, they had Abilene Christian, North Texas, and Oral Roberts. They didn't just make the NCAA tournament; they won NCAA tournament games. Of course, Arkansas had to beat Oral Roberts to get the Elite Eight. So, yeah, I think it's a quality schedule, and it's not their fault Illinois got beat. On paper, you thought they would have played Illinois by now, but they're not. I think Oklahoma's going to be, quality opponent. Kansas State's probably not going to finish real high in the Big 12, but I think that's a solid opponent too, especially playing them on a neutral floor.
Yeah, I really like Cincinnati's potential. They've got two really good guards, and I think Jeremiah Davenport and David DeJulius. DeJulius gave Arkansas fits when they played in Kansas City. So that good guard play is what's going to carry you for the most part, in the latter stages of the season. And then, I can't imagine, just looking at some numbers, that the Ivy League has just a bunch of great defensive teams. And I think Jordan Dingle, the volume shooter and scorer that he is, I think he's probably going to have a good run in that conference schedule for Penn. And I think we're going to look up, and those are going to be two of their best wins of the year.
Don't overlook Hofstra, by the way, here in a couple of weeks. I was looking at their schedule the other day. They took Houston to overtime at Houston. They lost by 2 at Maryland, and they had a close game against Iona, who just beat Alabama the other day. So that's a team. I think Speedy Claxton's their head coach now. That could be a team that, and Arkansas never really plays that well at North Little Rock. That could be a really interesting game coming up on December the 18th. The basketball podcast of Mid-America is brought to you by Landers Toyota of Northwest Arkansas. Visit them at their location on Metro Parkway and Rogers, or online at landerstoyotanwa.com.
For all your automotive needs, shop Landers Toyota NWA in Rogers, where we guarantee you the best buying experience and best service after the sale in Arkansas. Landers Toyota NWA in Rogers.
Up next for the Razorbacks is Saturday afternoon. They'll play Arkansas Little Rock at Bud Walton Arena. It's a 3:00 tip-off, and that game will be televised by SEC Network. Of course, the Trojans are coached by former Razorback All-American Darrell Walker. Bob, you've been around long enough that you covered Darrell as a player too. What are your memories of Darrell Walker as a player for the youngsters like Scotty and I who never got to see him play?
Well, Darrell was from Chicago, and he was a tough player. He was Chicago tough. Great defender. He was basically the quintessential Eddie Sutton guard. I think he's 6'4", good length like we've talked about, and he just was a defensive demon. I can't remember how many steals and dunks he got, but a game like last night, Darrell would have had about 5 dunks, I think, off steals. And him and Alvin Robertson were such a great backcourt pair. There were some teams now, even some Southwest Conference teams, where guys literally struggled to get the ball up the court against those two. They were, I think, they're one of the greatest guard combinations in college history. Think about it. Darrell was the 12th pick of the Knicks, and Alvin was the 7th pick of the Spurs. And of course, this is back in a time when guys didn't leave college early. And but yeah, Darrell was just incredibly tough. He was a great rebounder. There was one year he played in the NBA with they were then the Washington Bullets. And Wes Unseld was his head coach. And Wes Unseld, if people don't know, was one of the great rebounders in NBA history. He was 6'7" from Louisville, but he could rebound like he was 7 feet. And I went to a Mavs Bullets game, and Darrell was averaging like 7 rebounds. He was leading their team, and I remember talking to Wes Unseld about Darrell Walker's rebounding. And so, Darrell wasn't a guy now he averaged a lot of points in college, like 20-something points, but I'd have to look up his career stats, but his career line in the NBA is something like probably 11 points, 5.5 rebounds, 4 assists, 3 steals. I mean, he was just a very complete player, filled up the box score. He's one of the greatest guards Arkansas has ever had. And he's real tough as a coach. He brings those Eddie Sutton, principles to UALR. And I know they had a tough loss to Colorado State last night, but I think they're 4-4, and I'm sure they'll be very fired up to come in here and play the Razorbacks.
Usually we don't get point spreads until about 24 hours before college basketball games. Scotty, though, looking through their schedule, you got to believe this is going to be a game that Arkansas is favored to win by quite a bit. Again, I'm looking at their 4 wins. They beat a team called Champion Christian. I've never heard of them. They beat Arkansas Baptist, which is from a lower division. And they've lost 4 of their last 5. They did beat Northern Illinois, but like Bob said, they lost by 31 at Colorado State. They lost by 14 at Tulsa, 18 to Sam Houston, 19 to Loyola Marymount. This is certainly a game where you feel like Arkansas should be able to control the game and get a lot of players into the rotation, which is something Eric Musselman has expressed frustration with prior to last night.
Yeah, I think you're right on the money there. I don't know what the spread is going to be on this game, and I figure it might be in that 28 to 30 point range, just kind of like it was on Wednesday against UCA. Like, with all due respect, like UALR is just not a very good team, and I know Darrell Walker's a good coach. His guys are just really struggling. They just look at their KenPom page; it's just a lot of red. And if you look at KenPom very often, seeing red on a team's profile page is not a good thing. About the only thing they do really well on offense is they take a healthy amount of free throw attempts, and they knock down free throws at a fairly good clip. But just about everything else is been a struggle for them to this point. So I think if Arkansas can limit some kind of petty, needless fouls, not get too handsy with UALR, maybe on the perimeter. Arkansas has been really good pressuring opposing backcourts, high on the perimeter this year. And JD Note, Chris Likes, maybe even Devo Davis, Stanley Amude a couple of times too. They've been really good at creating turnovers near midcourt. And I think if Arkansas can put some pressure on ULR and come away with some steals, some fast break points, limit the Trojans' trips to the free throw line. I think this would probably be a runaway game. Again, kind of like UCA, and Eric will probably be able to empty his bench and evaluate some of his guys a little bit more.
Before our next podcast, Arkansas will also play Charlotte next Tuesday night at Bud Walton. That's going to be an 8 o'clock tip-off, also on the SEC Network. Bob, let's start with you. Over these next couple of games, UALR and Charlotte, what are you looking for from this Razorback team? What are the areas that you're going to be focused on, looking for improvement from this team?
Well, we've talked about, you look for improved perimeter shooting, probably both in shot selection and in percentage. That's something they need to work on and get better at going into SEC play. Like I said, I don't think they have to be a team that relies heavily on the three-pointer, because they score inside and they get to the free throw line. And other than the other night, they've shot free throws pretty well. But I think you need, and it just to take care of business. Don't be falling behind in the first half. Don't be having narrow leads at halftime. Put some of these spurts together in the first half, get control of the game. And like Scotty said, so you can, evaluate some of these bench players, build some depth, because you might need those guys if you have injuries or foul trouble or whatever, in bigger games. So, yeah, just kind of look for them to do a better job of taking care of business in the games so that they should win decisively and get a better look at the bench.
Scotty?
Yeah, for me, it's just I want to see Devo continue to build on what he did against UCA. And I think he had finished with 16 points. That was far and away a season high. I think his previous high was 10 in a couple games, about middle of November. But he scored 3 or 4 times in the open floor against the Bears. And that right there, that part of his game was missing earlier in the year. He's going into last night. I looked at this website called CBB Analytics, which is just blowing my mind right now. It's pretty fascinating. He was averaging just 1 point in transition on half of a fast break field goal attempt per game. That's just not who Devo is. That's not what he was last year. If that number rises, which I'm sure it will pretty soon, that's a good sign for Arkansas. I just thought he was so much more aggressive. Even in the half court too, he drew 5 fouls, which is team high, and he shot a team high 7 free throws. And Eric Musselman and Devo both said last night that he just got back to playing with a little bit more joy. And he just played loose. And early on in the season, I thought Devo played with some emotion, but it to me felt like it was more edginess that we weren't kind of accustomed to seeing than joy. He mentioned that he talked to his mom and his grandma. They're just like, you need to smile more, just have fun more. Sometimes just talking to a couple of your wives can just kind of help you get right mentally. So I'm looking for Devo to continue that, to maybe build on what he did on Wednesday.
This Arkansas basketball team, they kind of remind me, and I'm not saying they're as good as Cincinnati football, but, there's been so much talk about Cincinnati football and are they winning pretty enough? Well, they're winning, and that's what Arkansas is doing. And I thought it was kind of funny, Eric Musselman wearing his Oscar the Grouch t-shirt after the game last night. That his wife had given him, said, just enjoy the wins, man. Don't be a grouch after you win. I know he's looking forward, and obviously that's what makes him a good coach. But I think that, there's a certain element to that you do need to enjoy the wins when you're able to have them. And right now, Arkansas has done everything that they need to do. They've won all 7 of their games. Like I said earlier, we'll be back with another podcast next week after the Razorbacks play Charlotte. It'll be kind of a fun podcast. We'll be looking forward to that game between Arkansas and OU at BOK Center on December the 11th. Bob mentioned this. It could be a matchup of a couple of top 25 teams, also a future SEC matchup between the Razorbacks and the Sooners. For Scotty Bordelon and Bob Holt, I'm Matt Jones. Visit us at WholeHogSports.com for more Razorback basketball coverage, and we'll see you again next week.
The proceeding has been a production of WholeHogSports.com. Look for our latest podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast store. And visit us anytime at WholeHogSports.com for the latest news and commentary.